And that tends to explain why most people's hip pain symptoms at night are a little bit more vague, a little bit more non-specific, and also a little bit harder to localize because the pain feels like it's there, but it may actually be coming from somewhere else. G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you how to fix hip pain from sleeping on your side at night by addressing the hidden underlying cause of that hip pain. And it's something that I don't think many people are talking about, but it's relatively simple and straightforward once you get that broader perspective. So the way that I want to structure this video is I obviously want to give you an exercise that can help your hip feel better tonight when you go to sleep, but I also want to make sure I take some time to talk to you about the necessary perspective needed to understand what you need to change to make sure that your hip doesn't become sore again in the future. So the first thing I want to talk about before we get into this helpful exercise is to give you the perspective of where that pain might actually be coming from. And based on what I find clinically, an overwhelming number of patients who have hip pain at night when they're trying to sleep have pain that's actually referred from their back. Now, obviously, if you have some specific hip trauma or a hip injury, whether it's maybe you've just had surgery on the hip or whether you've got a hip tear or something like that, then that can genuinely be causing your pain, obviously. But for the overwhelming majority of people who just develop hip pain at night when they're sleeping and don't generally have it during the day, it may actually be referred from your back. And that tends to explain why most people's hip pain symptoms at night are a little bit more vague, a little bit more non-specific, and also a little bit harder to localize because the pain feels like it's there, but it may actually be coming from somewhere else. So the exercise that we're going to go through in a second is going to hopefully help you figure out where in your low back that's coming from, and then give you the capacity to resolve that going forwards relatively quickly. So the other thing I think is really important to understand here is that if you do find with the ball, a tennis ball or a lacrosse ball, that you have a section of your back that is contributing to your hip pain, there also has to be a genuine reason why that specific area of your back has become dysfunctional in its own right. So what we're also going to do after we go through this exercise is we're going to have a genuine conversation about your postural habits and or the shapes and positions you put your back into throughout the day that might explain why that section of your back has become dysfunctional enough to give you dysfunction into your hip at night when you're trying to sleep. So as I said, we want to have a well-rounded, broad conversation, develop the necessary perspective to fix this hip pain and stop it from coming back long term. So the exercise that I want to get you to go through, again, just involves having a tennis ball or a lacrosse ball. You can use a foam roller if you have one. Choose whatever you feel gives you the best access, that makes you feel like you're doing the best job at finding and releasing these stiff, tight, and restricted areas. And all we want to get you to do basically is we want to go looking at the base of your rib cage and the top of your lower back. Now the reason for this is these are the levels that communicate with your hip, whether it's through direct neural connections where the nerves that contribute to gluteal function originate from your lower back, or things like dermatomes and myotomes, which also originate from your spine and communicate with the soft tissue of your hip. So we don't want to discriminate, we don't have to be too fancy. All we want to do is take a ball and go hunting through sections of your lower back for, again, things that feel stiff, tight, restricted, maybe tender, it may not be tender. We want to value restriction more than tenderness because your back may not be sore in its own right. So what we want to get you to do is place the ball into the middle of your low back, maybe the base of your rib cage. Just let it roll straight off to the fleshy part where the musculature is, because underneath this is where the joints are that might be referring pain to your back. And what we want to get you to do is gently lie down onto that ball, and you can definitely do this up against a wall if lying isn't for you at the moment. You can also do it sitting in a chair, provided that the back of that chair is hard enough that you feel like it gives you enough purchase with the ball into your back. And what we're looking for here is we're not rolling around. We just want to move the ball up and down and let it press in periodically into your back, and looking for those areas that feel restricted and more dense than the other side. So what I want to get you to do is, once you've got a strong sense of how this spot feels that you're on, literally compare it to the exact same spot on the other side and see which side feels the most restricted. Because the really interesting thing about this, and we've covered this on the channel before, is that irrespective of what side of your hip hurts when you're trying to sleep on your side at night,
the side that we need to treat of your spine may not be the same side. It absolutely could be, and it is in about 50% of cases based on what I find, but your body doesn't look at you as much of a left and a right as we tend to for descriptive purposes. So if you find the segment of your spine that's stiff, either side of that spine can be contributing to the referred sensation that you might be feeling in your hip. So just make sure that when you found the segment that you feel is stiff or segments that you feel is stiff, double check both sides to make sure that one side isn't stiffer than the other and you're not missing something that could be on the other side. And the exercise/assessment technique is basically finding a spot that feels restricted and just letting it press in. It's nothing fancy, but what you'll find is that if your low back is overloaded and irritated enough, you may find that it will communicate with your hip in some way. You may find that there's a pressure that develops in your hip. Maybe your exact pain and discomfort comes out. But if you only feel this hip pain when sleeping on your side at night, it may not come out during the day. It may be once your back is overloaded enough, and once we hit nighttime, if things get a little bit inflamed, that tends to be more when inflammation comes out at nighttime. So you may not notice these symptoms until nighttime. So you may not get this really clear connection between your back being stiff and creating or decreasing some of your hip symptoms, but still keep an eye out for it just in case. And what I tend to find for most of my patients is it takes for you to do this before going to bed, potentially at night before going to bed, timing it correctly so you can get that hip related issue, or freeing up these sections enough going to sleep and then seeing how you wake up the next morning and how it felt. Now, the other thing that I think is really important to do is you still want to get the ball into that hip, because what can happen is you may obviously have some genuine hip dysfunction going on, and that's fair enough, but we need to rule out the possibility of your low back being the genuine cause of this dysfunction. And as I said, the interesting thing about this is if your low back has been causing gluteal or hip dysfunction for long enough, some of the local muscles in your hip may also start to become tight and tender in their own right, because your brain's asking them to based on what's going on. So you may need to get the ball into your hip and try and find some local hip tightness, some local hip tenderness, gently let the ball press in, let that tissue release and free up. But what I would urge you to do is, if you really want to understand what that connection is between your back and your hip, it's probably best not to treat your hip the first few times and just go for the low back stuff, because if you do both and things get better, you may not actually be able to tell which of the two things that you did made the biggest difference. Obviously, if you just need to sleep, who cares? Do both. But for the long-term fix, we need to make sure we clearly understand what's causing this dysfunction. The second thing that I wanted to touch on with this, and as I sort of teased briefly before, is if you found a specific section of your back or segments of your back, if you move the ball up and down and find multiple areas, there has to be a genuine reason why that specific part of your spine has become dysfunctional in its own right, and more specifically, why one side feels stiffer than the other. So if you have a left side that feels stiffer, and by releasing that you feel that whichever hip you are having trouble with becomes less painful at night, there has to be a very specific reason why that has become dysfunctional in the first place. And what we've sort of discussed previously is we need to take a very close look at the positions, shapes, and postures you put your back into during the day, not specifically at night, which again can be confusing because a lot of people's hip pain happens at night when they're sleeping on their side. So it would make perfect sense that that is the position that you need to work hard on. But what I find clinically is that when you are lying on your side, you are across gravity, and most people tend to sleep for close to maybe 6 to 8 hours a night. But when we look at what you do during the day, if you're only sleeping for 6 hours of a night time in a perfect world, that still leaves another 18 hours of stuff that you are doing during the day. So potentially 3 times more time spent doing things upright against gravity as opposed to across gravity, loading up your spine in ways that you aren't doing when you're lying down in bed at night. And what I find most important for this conversation is that the things that cause that very specific segmental local dysfunction in your back that's referring pain to your hip, they tend to be the postures and the shapes that you get into the most throughout the day, each and every day throughout your work day or leisure time. So we're thinking sitting at a computer, obvious ones, sitting on a couch watching TV, driving a car, sitting up in bed reading a book, all the things that we tend to talk about on the channel, which are relatively boring by comparison.
but maybe sucking you into a certain posture or shape consistently throughout the day without you realizing it, that's isolating a hinge into your back, creating increased tension and load going through there, and forcing your body to adapt to that over time. And obviously, if you have one side that's stiffer than the other, then there might be some asymmetry in that. So if you're sitting down in a bit of a slouchy posture, but always reaching for the mouse, or always sitting into the corner of a couch, or sitting in a certain position while you're driving the car, or if you're someone who's in this really awkward sort of half sitting, half lying position a lot, even if you're not sitting or being stationary throughout the day, but you're standing up leaning over something, whether it's a workbench or a bed like myself as a physio, or maybe you're a chef or you're a cook, or you're someone who's working over a bench, bending and twisting and leaning into a certain position that's the same every day, it's very likely that that shape is isolating the very same part of your back that's generating your hip pain. So I hope that was genuinely helpful. Let me know in the comments down below how these exercises go for you, and whether you do find that your vague, non-specific, random hip pain when lying on your side at night is due to your low back or not, because I think you'll be pleasantly surprised that if you do fit into that category, there's potentially going to be some low back stuff there that you may never have realized going forward. So with that being said, again, I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.